Right, welcome to crop production and management. We're now moving on to the crop section of your agriculture course, which I think is a nice section. The first chapter in it is a little bit dry, but it gives us an overview of the principles that will kind of inform all the other chapters, all the individual crops. Um, Bad news is they got rid of a few crops that used to be on the old course that were quite nice, like oats and maize and wheat. Oats I can kind of understand because it's fairly insignificant in Ireland at this stage. There's, I think, maybe two major producers of oats, both selling to Flavins, and that's about it. Maize, though, is on the increase, and I was surprised that they got rid of it, but not to worry. We are still going to be studying potatoes, a fair staple in Ireland, and also barley, which is a very important crop to us. And we will then look at some catch crops, and we'll also look at some energy crops. And you may be less familiar with the two of those. But to start with, in this chapter, we look at the kind of principles and management that are involved in growing any crop. So all of these factors that we're looking at in this chapter would inform how you would go about growing any crop in your farm. So first of all, let's look at seed certification in Ireland. So if you're going to be producing any crop, you would like to use certified seed in Ireland because it's a known entity, I suppose, and it will give you higher germination rates and less problems with disease and all sorts. But before we get on to that, how does a seed actually qualify to appear in our national seed catalogue? So if you were somebody who was after coming up with a new variety of seed and you wanted that to appear for sale in our national seed catalogue, which shows all the certified seed in it, how would you go about getting it included, or what criteria does it have to satisfy? Well, first of all, it has to have a name, and it has to be deemed by the Department of Agriculture and Food and the Marine to be of agricultural merit. So it has to be worth putting in there. It must have value for cultivation or use. That's the way they sum up whether it's worth putting in there or not. As well as that, it gets tested to see, does it satisfy certain criteria? Is the seed variety that you've come up with, is it distinct, which means has it got traits that are significantly different from the other seeds that are there already? Uniformity might seem to go against distinctness, but what they mean by that is in a sample of seed that you would supply, are all of the seeds or nearly all of the seeds of that same variety that you're putting forward. And then stability refers to whether the traits that are different or distinct about this seed variety that you're bringing to the market or looking to bring to the market, do they hold up from generation to generation? So that would be the test for certification and being put into the National Seed Catalogue. So what is certified seed then? Or why would you go about using certified seed? Well, certified seed, in order to be certified, the seed has to have 98% purity, which is a very high level of purity. Now, that would apply to barley, wheat, oats, grass, and maize seed. But if you look at perennial ryegrass, it tends to be a little bit lower. The percentage there is 96% purity. And then it also has to have an 85% germination rate. That means that if you get 100 seeds, 85 of that 100 or more will germinate. And that holds up again for most of them, except for the ryegrass and white clover, which would be an 80% germination rate. And then maize actually would be a higher germination rate. So in order to be certified maize seed, it has to hit a 90% germination rate. And then it has to be treated with fungicide and pesticide as well. And that's the farmer's guarantee, I suppose, that they're not going to have as much disease problems if they use this certified seed. Right, let's look now at some of the factors that are involved in crop management. So, what is crop management, first of all? Well, crop management refers to all the different practices that a farmer takes into consideration when he is looking to get his seed to germinate, to establish, to grow in a healthy way and in a quick way, and to give him a high yield. So, what are all the things he needs to think about when he's planning in his farm? Okay. Now, we've already covered seed certification, but as well as using certified seed, which he would undoubtedly do if he wants to get his best growth and his best yield, he also has to think about the variety of seed. For instance, in Ireland, we tend to grow a lot of winter barley rather than spring barley, and certain varieties of seed would be deemed winter varieties, others would be deemed spring varieties. And you don't want to get that wrong. If you are sowing a spring variety in winter, you're obviously not going to get the same amount of germination from that particular variety of seed. The soil and the water then, well, obviously enough, if you have a soil with good drainage, that's going to help you with a lot of your crops. In fact, some of them need really well drained soil. If you had a heavy clay soil, for instance, you wouldn't grow maize on it because maize will need quite a warm soil, and as we know from our study of the soil chapters, clay is quite a cold soil. Then previous crop history, and this brings us to rotation. If you've had a root crop in there, you are not going to suddenly start growing potatoes straight after that, because many of the pests that you would have in your root crop can stay over the course of one winter, and then they would affect the potatoes when you put them in there. So if you have good rotation, which we'll be studying a little bit later, you can avoid some of the problems with pests that might otherwise be an issue when you're growing your crop. Plant nutrition then and fertilizer. If you do soil tests prior to sowing, you'll be able to tell what your soil is lacking. Is it lacking in nitrogen or in phosphorus or in potassium? And then that'll inform how much fertilizer you're going to need for different plants, because different plants have different requirements for nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium. So again, you're looking at the suitability of the soil there. Your seeding rate. So that refers to the number of seeds that you should sow to optimize the yield of the crop. Obviously enough, if you sow less seeds, then you get a lower overall yield. It could also give too much space for weeds in the crop if you go with a low seeding rate. So a good management program when you're planning your crops will optimize the seeding rate. So that'll take into account what size of seed you're spreading and how much space is needed for that size of seed. Generally speaking, smaller seeds and smaller crops will need less space than larger seeds and larger crops. And then the weather and the timing. Weather is very important in Ireland, and it'll have a direct impact on what date you sow, how much fertilizer you're going to end up using when you're going to harvest the crop. If you're planting winter varieties, you need to sow them early enough that you'll get the crop germinated and established before the temperatures get too cold. Things like that come into your weather and your timing. So that's your crop management principles. Now, of course, the different practices that you do for crop management will also have an impact on animals. For instance, if you grow a catch crop, such as your stubble turnips or your kale, that can give you winter fodder, which is shown there in the diagram, or in the picture, I should say. If you practice good weed control, that will improve your pasture for your animals as well. If you have good drainage in your soil, and that's going to lower the amount of pests that you have, and that can be important for animals as well as for any crops. For instance, you could lower the amount of liver fluke if you're talking about your grassland. Then you have your rotation. Okay, it reduces the pests for crop growth, but would also reduce pests that might have an impact on your animals, like your worms. Pesticides then, if you're applying pesticides, you might, for instance, be getting rid of your aphids, and those aphids or greenfly are vectors of disease. In particular, they carry a lot of viruses. If you plant energy crops, then those energy crops tend to give good shelter for, maybe if you're talking about your mycanthus or something like that, you'd get shelter for birds, and even habitats for little tiny animals, little mice and shrews and things like that. And then your energy crops. If you're planting energy crops, you're giving ground cover at a time when the ground would normally be fallow or just left bare, and that again provides little channels, little wildlife corridors essentially. So that's again going to improve the movement of animals and biodiversity. Okay, a key one that comes up a lot on test papers, or rather has in the old course anyway, is the advantages of winter varieties over spring varieties of seed. So I mentioned earlier, a typical example there would be your barley. Why in Ireland do we tend to sow more winter barley than spring barley, and use more of the winter varieties of seed than the spring varieties of seed? And there's a good few different reasons. So the winter varieties tend to be frost resistant, whereas the spring varieties don't. And that's quite important in Ireland because, of course, we do get frost in our winter and even into our spring as well. We can get frost in Ireland right up until April. Then they have a longer growing season because the winter varieties can be sown from September to November and then harvested from mid-July onwards, whereas the spring varieties, you tend to be sowing them from February to April. And of course, you're taking a risk if you're sowing them in February or March. If they happen to be not frost resistant, you're taking quite a risk there. But even if you don't suffer from frost, if you sow them in February to April and then you harvest them around August, you have a shorter growing season there, which brings us on to the third one, which is that your winter varieties have a higher yield. Obviously enough, the longer they're growing, the bigger they get, the higher the yield you get. So your winter varieties, because they're in the ground longer, they grow for longer and they get bigger. They can be harvested then in July. I mentioned that already, and that's before you've any real issue with bad weather. If you plant a spring variety, you might be talking August, September when you start harvesting it, and the longer you go, the more chance there is of rain in Ireland, which can have an impact on harvesting. And then the last one, which maybe not everyone would think of, it lessens the labour load in spring on a mixed farm enterprise. Now, what do we mean by that? If you are a dairy farmer, as well as having tillage, so as well as having crops, you're going to be pretty darn busy in spring with calving. And if you're very busy in spring with calving, you don't want to have to be dealing with going out there and sowing barley as well. So it is good if you can get that bit of work out of the way in the previous October, November time, and you're able to focus then completely on your calving in the springtime. Now, seed germination then. So we've taken into account, so far we've looked at the different type of seed that you can get, and we've looked at winter varieties versus spring varieties of seed. So what kind of things affect the germination of seeds? Well, some of these would jump straight into your head straight away. Some of them are related to the soil, and some of them are related to the weather and the climate, which would be the ones I suppose that we would think of. One that you might not have thought of immediately would be the depth of sowing. Now, if you plant certain seeds too deep, they won't germinate, and other seeds, if you plant them too shallow, you'll have difficulties with germination. An example of that would be your barley. Barley, you'll only plant that about 3 centimeters deep, whereas potatoes, you need to plant maybe 10 centimeters deep. If you plant potatoes too shallow, then they'll very quickly come to the surface when they start to germinate, and you'll soon have problems with greening of the potatoes, and green potatoes can't be sold. If you plant small seeds too deep, they may not germinate at all. Anyone who's ever planted lettuce in their polytunnel will be familiar with that as well. Lettuce have a very tiny little seed, and you want just the tiniest little covering of compost on top of that lettuce. If there's any more, it won't germinate at all because lettuce needs a little bit of light to germinate. So depth of sowing is quite important as to whether the seed will germinate or not. Soil compaction should be a relatively obvious one, I suppose. If the soil is too compacted down on top of the seed, then the little shoot and little roots will find it too difficult to make their way through the soil and access nutrients and make their way up to the light as well. Soil pH then. Soil pH, of course, affects the availability of nutrients, and so it's quite obvious that that would affect germination. Drainage or saturation of the soil. If you have too much water in the soil, it can be as bad as too little water in the soil. It can effectively drown the roots in that they're not getting any air and therefore they can't do any respiration. The soil type. Now, we've covered that extensively when we were doing all about the chemical properties of soil. But of course, that would affect your germination in terms of the nutrients that are available. And now, the last two we might not have come across before. So, temperature refers to, yes, soil temperature, but also air temperature. And certain seeds need to get above a certain temperature before they will germinate. Maize would be one in particular. It needs a good deal of warmth before it'll germinate, and that is why maize is sometimes sown under plastic so that it will increase the soil temperature and provide that higher temperature for germinating maize. And photoperiod. The photoperiod is the length of time each day that your plant gets sunlight effectively, and some seeds won't germinate until the photoperiod is long enough, so until the days are long enough effectively. Now, moving on to crop rotation is another important principle that will come into any crop enterprise. Most of you, I'm sure, have at least a nodding familiarity with what crop rotation is. It's the basic idea is that you don't grow the same crop in the same place year on year. You would try in general to have a healthy progression from maybe a root type crop to cereal or to a grass. Now, you wouldn't ever go in after your turnips. You wouldn't ever go in with potatoes straight after turnips. If you did, you'd find that some of the same pests like our turnips as like our potatoes. So those pests can actually just overwinter and they'll be waiting there then for the potato afterwards. So varying your crop from year to year allows a chance for those pests, the population of those pests, to have decreased by the next time you bring in a similar crop. What else does it do? It gives you better nutrient management. Certain crops are heavy in their need for certain nutrients. So if you were to grow those same crops year on year, then you would find you're just spending ridiculous amounts of money on fertilizer. Potatoes being a classic example. Really, you'd only ever have potatoes 1 year in 4 in a rotation because it takes quite a while for the soil to recover after them. And you tend to go in after potatoes, you tend to go in with something that's quite lighten its nutritional needs. And then improving soil structure. If you have a good healthy rotation, particularly if you put in something with a nice fibrous root system like your grass, that's great for the structure of the soil. The grass binds the soil together and prevents erosion of the soil and helps it to recover from any heavy tillage operations, any deep ploughing, harrowing, etc., that might just break up the structure of the soil a bit. Now, the next thing we're going to look at is how do you control pests, weeds, etc. So there are a few different methods by which you can control pests, weeds, and diseases. The first one we're going to look at is biological control. And why is it called biological control? Because it centers around the predator-prey relationship. So if you have a particular pest of your crops, you can biologically control it, which the organic farmers would be big fans of this one. You can biologically control it by introducing its predator. And the classic example there would be these little aphids that you can see. Aphids are horrendously bad vectors of viruses, etc. They're desperate for your potatoes. But if you had a nice big population of ladybirds, you'll find they eat all of your aphids, and you don't have to worry about the aphids being vectors of viruses, carrying viruses onto your crop. Then there are various methods of indirect control. Now, an indirect control means you bring in practices that aren't actually stamping out the pest directly. So you're not treating the pest, you're not getting rid of the pest, you're just discouraging the establishment of the pest. So you're getting in there before these pests and diseases are a problem, and you're having healthy methods that will help avoid those pests or diseases ever coming on your crop. Now, here are some methods of indirect control. We've already mentioned crop rotation, and our example of that was, if you remember, that you wouldn't put potatoes after turnips or vice versa because they have similar pests. So if you are to plant maize after your potatoes, that is giving a chance for the potato cyst nematode to decrease in the soil, and that means that you've less of a chance if you go in there after that with a tuber or with a root crop the year after. There's less of a chance of that pest establishing itself. So you're discouraging the pest with your practice of crop rotation. You're preventing it rather than curing. Growth encouragement. If you plan your growing and plant your crops when they are most likely to thrive, when they're most likely to germinate quickly and establish quickly, if you apply fertilizer at the right rate, then you encourage the growth of the crop. And the quicker that crop grows, the quicker it covers the ground and discourages weeds. And the healthier and the stronger the growth is, the less susceptible it is to fungal attack and things like that. Timely harvesting is quite linked to that. If you leave certain crops in particular in the ground when they are ripe and ready for harvest, they are far more likely to attract pests and fungus as well. So get in there and harvest them as soon as they're ready to be harvested. That's a good way of preventing disease from hitting your crops or pests from hitting your crops. Sowing resistant crop varieties then, well, certain varieties are well known for their resistance to certain diseases. For instance, your rooster potatoes are very good at resisting potato scab, which is a disease that's common if your pH is slightly too high in your soil. So if you sow resistant varieties, then you're less likely to suffer with the disease. And finally, stubble cleaning. Stubble cleaning is when you plough in the leftovers. So after you've harvested your crop, you plough in the stubble that's left from that crop, and then you This means that you are less likely to have it harbouring pests for the next growing season. Now, those were the indirect methods of controlling your pests. We're now going to look at the direct control, and direct control is really chemical control. It's sprays. It's spraying herbicide, pesticide, or fungicide, and they control, in turn, the herbicides control your weeds, the pesticides control pests, and the fungicides will get rid of any fungal diseases. Now, under the heading of herbicide, then, we have a few things to consider. First of all, what is a herbicide? Well, it's a chemical that you spray to kill plants or to inhibit their growth. Now, there are two different types of herbicide, two major different types, which are a total herbicide or a selective herbicide. A total herbicide is sometimes called a non-selective herbicide. It kills all plant life. It actually doesn't distinguish between weeds or crops or anything. It just wipes everything out. It'll be used if you're trying to clear an area completely. Roundup would be a typical example of a total herbicide. Now, you wouldn't go using that, we'll say, on your lawn. If you were trying to get rid of the moss and you sprayed a total herbicide like Roundup, you'd get rid of the moss, yes, but you'd also get rid of all the grass. Whereas a selective herbicide then does exactly what it says on the tin. It is selective. It doesn't kill everything. It'll kill certain species of plant without harming the other ones. A lot of the selective herbicides are for targeting your broadleaf weeds in your cereals. So our principal cereals all belong to the family of Gramineae, which means that they're grass-like. And if any of you are doing biology, you'll know that the grasses are monocots, meaning they have thin leaves. If you spray with a selective herbicide, it will be absorbed more by the broader leaves in your crop, and therefore it'll get rid of the broadleaf weeds. Now, unfortunately, if you sprayed way too much of it, you would also kill some of your crops. So you have to be very careful in your measurement of your selective herbicide, or it'll become a total herbicide. Then other categories. You also have your pre-emergent and your post-emergent herbicides, and again, these do exactly what they say on the tin. So a pre-emergent is one that you actually spray on before you see any weeds in the crop. How does it work? Well, it gets into the weeds and stops their cell division, and eventually they just die back. Whereas post-emergent ones you spray when you see the weeds, after they have germinated and you can actually see them in the crop. Now, the next slide has the heaviest of the terminology, I suppose, and it's called the modes of herbicide action. Basically, what that means is, how do these herbicides work? So there's 3 different ways that your herbicides can work. They can be either contact herbicides. Now, contact herbicides kill only what they meet. So if you spray them and they hit the foliage, then they'll kill the foliage that they come into contact with, the leaves that they come into contact with. So you need to be sure that you're completely covering the plants that you want to get rid of. They tend to be used on annual weeds. They wouldn't be useful on the perennial weeds, because perennial weeds will come straight back up again. Annual weeds, once you got rid of them once, they're gone. Then the second category are the translocated herbicides. Now, translocation means movement of location. What this means is, if you get them anywhere on the plant, they will be transported in the plant to the stem, to the leaf, to the root, and these ones are great for the perennial weeds because they will kill them off, and then they will kill them if they come into any contact whatsoever with them, and you won't have to be going back in there and hitting them again a little while later with more of your herbicide. And then the last one's the soil acting herbicide. Now, sometimes they're called residual herbicides, and they're actually applied to the soil, and then as the weed seedlings are germinating, they absorb them and they die. So those are your three modes of action. Just be careful on the headings of these ones. So that's the three methods by which your herbicides can work: contact, translocated, or soil acting. Okay, now that's us finished on the herbicides. So the herbicides, remember, are the weed killers. Okay, we're now on to fungicides. So if we want to, a lot of the plant diseases that we deal with actually are caused by fungus. A fungicide then is the chemical that kills or inhibits the growth of a fungus. Again, you have a few different types. You have your contact, you have your systemic, your translaminar, and your protective. Now, horrible names, but some of them relate back to what we just did about the herbicides. So the contact, first of all, the contact fungicide will only kill the fungi that they come into contact with. So that was exactly like what we did for the herbicide. Then the systemic, you should consider those as being quite like the translocated ones that we were talking about earlier. So they're absorbed and translocated to all the different parts of, excuse me, all the different parts of the plant. The systemic ones. Then moving on to the translaminar. Now, lamina is the other name for the blade of the leaf. So they're absorbed by the upper surface of the leaf blade and they're translocated down onto the lower surface of the leaf blade, and they'll kill any fungus that's growing on that lower leaf blade. Now, the translaminar ones are great for any fungus that attacks the leaves, but they're not going to be translocated to the stem or to the root. Okay, and then the protective fungicide. That's one that you go in with before there's any evidence of fungal attack. It works to prevent the attack of the fungus wherever it is applied. You'd want to make sure though that you get in there to protect the crop before any fungus has got to it, because it won't kill fungus that's already there. Now on to pesticides then. So what is a pest? Well, a pest is a tiny little animal or an insect that is eating your plant or spreading disease. So what's a pesticide? It's the chemical that's used to kill the pests. Now there are three different types. By far the most common would be your insecticide, and they're used to kill off insects that are pests of your plant crops and also animals. Your aphiticide, would be would be an example of that. It's used to control or to kill aphids, which, as we know, are vectors of viruses. Another example of a pesticide would be bait. So if you spread bait around a crop, it gets eaten by the pest, and then that bait is poisonous to the pest. An example of that would be your slug pellets. So if you're growing any of the brassicas, like your cabbage, your lettuces, anything like that, that's nice and leafy, slugs love it. So you can spread slug pellets, and then they eat the slug pellets and they are poisoned and die. Fumigants. Really, you wouldn't come across the fumigants unless you're a major greenhouse grower or you are growing mushrooms. But anyway, they're gases that are used in an enclosed space like a greenhouse to kill pests. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of using all these chemicals? Well, the obvious benefits are increased food production. If you manage to kill pests, diseases and weeds, then you're increasing the productivity of your crop overall. You're giving more of your crop a better chance to reach maturity and give you a nice high yield. If you get a high yield, then you get increased profit for the farmer. Also decreased damage caused by pests and diseases. So pests can sometimes, they might not kill off the plants, but they might actually damage the plants. They might eat parts of them. And decreased labour, one you might not necessarily think of unless, of course, you've tried to deal with slugs on your cabbages and lettuce in your polytunnel without using slug pellets. And then you'll know that there's a lot of labour involved in dealing with those slugs, or even dealing with your weeds. If you go fully organic in your garden and you've spent days and days pulling weeds, you'll know that yes, there is a place for some herbicides in a larger scale enterprise in particular. Then what are the disadvantages? Well, there's the obvious buildup of toxins. So when the chemicals get into the food chain, they can be accumulated as they go up the food chain, and the top consumer actually gets a fair old concentration of chemicals. Incidentally, it is said that our nod to washing our apples wouldn't even come near getting rid of the amount of different chemicals that are put on them. And this brings us on to the second one, which is the possible harm to human health. Then killing of other living organisms as well. So sometimes, unfortunately, these can get into our waterways, and if they do, they can lead indirectly to or directly to the killing of other animals. And pollution of the air, of the water, and of the soil. And unfortunately as well, there's a certain amount of resistance building up amongst some pests to our pesticides as well, with the increase in usage now that we're doing things on a much more commercial scale than we used to. Now we're getting towards the end of our presentation. Bacterial diseases of crops aren't really as important as the fungal diseases in that there's much less of them, but we do need to have a quick look at how to control or prevent bacterial diseases in your crops. So the main things you can do, you can plant resistant crop varieties. You can use dress seeds, which means that they have a coating put on them to prevent bacterial disease. You can use good crop rotation practices, which is kind of a go-to answer for preventing a lot of issues with crops. Clean tools and propagation materials. Now that one would be particularly important if you are doing, with say, fruit growing or in horticulture settings like that, that you are careful to clean your tools thoroughly so that you're not spreading bacteria from one place to another. Antibiotic sprays as well, and good pest control. And you might kind of go, how is that related to bacteria? But some pests will nibble on a fruit or nibble on a vegetable, and that creates an opening for the bacteria to get into the fruit or vegetable. There are some quarantine diseases that we have to be on the lookout for. These are infectious diseases that cause huge damage to crops, and if you want to plant a particular variety of crop that is known to harbour quarantine diseases, then you need a plant passport for it to bring it even into the country. Examples of that would be your brown rot and your ring rot on potatoes, and that will come up later in the potato chapter. Now, a couple of new additions to our course. One would be sustainable development for crop production. So what are the aims that are associated with sustainable development when it comes to crop production? Well, we would seek to prevent harmful organisms, first of all, in a kind of a non-invasive way by practicing things like crop rotation, by using clean machinery, by soil testing, by using certified seed and resistant varieties and things like that. We would then seek to monitor. So another aim would be to monitor harmful organisms and try to avoid them becoming an issue. And an example of that would be listening to forecasts for blight and just being aware and using spraying for blight only when necessary, when there are blight warnings on the forecast. Then using sustainable biological, physical and non-chemical methods for controlling weeds, pests and diseases rather than jumping straight to the one kill everything herbicide. And then targeted application of pesticides, so not using broad spectrum products. the theory there would be similar to the broad spectrum antibiotics that might be used by humans. The more use there is of these broad spectrum products, the more there's a build-up of resistance. So we would have some pests becoming resistant to certain pesticides. And that brings us nicely to organic farming. Um, so organic farming generally seeks to be more sustainable, I suppose, and have less of an environmental impact than other more intensive farming methods. So some of the production principles, if you are going to engage in organic farming, then you cannot use genetically modified organisms. You can't use organophosphates like pesticides. Um, your cultivation has to enhance the structure and the biodiversity, which generally means you're talking about minimum tillage operations, not doing any massive harrowing or anything like that that would really break the structure of your soil. It seeks to promote biological methods, and an example of that would be using microorganisms where possible to improve your soil condition or the availability of nutrients. You use organic manures and organic seeds, and only certified organic seeds at that, and only approved fertilizers. So if you absolutely need to use fertilizers, you can only go with ones that are approved, again, for organic use, and the same with your soil conditioners. So there, that's about the max of your tillage practices that you'll get away with in your organic, which is a fork. Now, safe work practices, then again, another kind of a new bit that we've been looking at in our new course. Farmers should place controls in place when operating tractors or other machinery to prevent accidents or injury through crushing, falls, injury to limbs, or injury to limbs by moving parts. And then your chemicals, obviously, whenever we're talking about chemicals, we have to make sure that they're locked in storage areas that are away from children in particular, but also light and heat in case there is any risk of fire. And goggles and gloves and PPE, personal protective equipment, should be used when you're handling any hazardous chemicals as well. And that is it for our crop production and principles chapter.